What is up, everybody? I am here with Ian Dallas, and today we are going to talk about what remains of Edith Finch. Ian, I'm super excited about this game, and I want you to tell me everything.
All right, well, I'll tell you what I know, partly because the game is still in development, so there are a lot of things that we're still figuring out. But Edith Finch is a game about a cursed family in Washington State, and you play as Edith Finch, who's a girl coming back to the house she grew up in. And as you're exploring this house, you're finding stories about the family members, and each of the stories is about how that family member died. And you're seeing a couple of generations of the family. And we're going to show today, I think, the first story of the game, which is Molly Finch, who's a 10-year-old girl in 1950 who wakes up and she's super hungry. So she goes around trying to find something to eat, and things sort of go from there.
Now, Ian, I'm incredibly curious. Where did this game come from? Where did the idea come from?
Well, the original idea was actually, it started out as a scuba diving simulator. That's the short description. Obviously, it's changed a lot since then. And it was based on the experience I had growing up in Washington State and doing a lot of scuba diving, and what it looks like when you're on the bottom of the ocean and you see the ocean just sloping away from you seemingly to infinity. And that feeling of something being simultaneously beautiful and horrifying. And so we tried to make a game that felt like that. And I was reading a lot of short fiction at the time, things like Lovecraft and Borges and Neil Gaiman. And one of the things I noticed is that a lot of those, like the things that I really loved, tended to be very short fiction. And there's something about these worlds that are just kind of inherently unstable. So it made sense for the game, instead of being one scuba diving simulator for however many hours, to break it up as a series of these short stories.
So basically, it's like you play stories, a series of stories that all tell different tales about these family members.
Yeah, and I mean, each of the stories ends in the same way. The family member dies, but how they get there, is very different, and hopefully something that feels evocative of that family member. Like one of the things that has been a big challenge is trying to balance these like very sublime, infinite spaces with something that feels human and intimate.
Right.
Because at some point, if it's just enormous landscape after enormous landscape, it stops feeling like something that's accessible to you. Like it stops feeling giant because you just get accustomed to it.
Yep.
So trying to make sure that each of these stories really puts you into the family member's perspective and has something that you as a person can kind of get into, which is actually a challenge that we had on Unfinished Swan, which is a game that, like our previous game, that is essentially an Alice in Wonderland story of a child going off into this fantastical landscape.
Right.
That it's very difficult to make that fantastical landscape feel grounded in the ways that I think is helpful for people to relate to. Because I mean, if it's too nonsensical, there's a point where you just kind of tune out, and so finding that balance has been interesting for us.
I'm very curious about the house that you have built. When I saw your sort of debut trailer, I was reminded of the Winchester house, that crazy house that exists with staircases that lead to nowhere and tells, really eccentric little stories everywhere you turn. I mean, was that an inspiration?
Yeah, the Winchester Mystery House was definitely one of the things that we looked at, and I think the thing that's most pertinent about that is that the Winchester Mystery House is a house that was always under construction. That until the day she died, the widow kept adding on to it, and you get these crazy things like staircases to nowhere and rooms that don't really have any business being there. We also looked at a whole bunch of other houses, like the world's largest tree house, and there's a little bit of Swiss Family Robinson as well.
Yeah.
And the house has kind of emerged as this focal point for a lot of the game, where like obviously, since as Edith you're exploring this house, it's a space that as a player you're going to get very familiar with, but it's also something that has a way of making these abstract ideas of a family and the way that death, kind of plays out in that more concrete for people to be able to see. So the house is actually like a series of levels, and each of the levels is built by a different family generation. So each of the generations kind of like you can sense kind of what this generation was about and how they were responding to the people that came before them just by how they're building the space. So trying to tell a little bit of the story through the architecture of the house.
Now, a lot of people are curious about how this game actually plays, and I'm just looking at the footage right now. I mean, I'm a bird right now.
Yes.
So you've gone really big with this game in terms of imagination, in terms of in terms of branching out, and you could be a cat as well, I take it.
Yeah, so in what you're seeing right now, this is, again, the first story that you're going to find as a player, and it's a 10-year-old girl who wakes up and is so hungry that she imagines herself becoming a series of animals. She goes from a cat to an owl to a shark and something later, and in each of these forms, she's eating bigger and bigger things. So what we were trying to do here is to echo the kind of callousness of childhood with the kind of unhuman elements of nature, where it's not that the shark hates the seal. It's not like the shark is evil or the seal is good or anything. It's just that this is the natural order of things, and trying to create a space where people can reflect on that a little bit, where as humans we're just used to eating our food out of boxes or whatever. Like, we don't really think about what has happened in order for that food to get to us. So trying to put people into a different perspective.
So this is just one story, and then we move to another story, and it will be completely different.
Yes, and this story is probably one of the crazier stories we're going to have in the game.
I love it that this is what you're demoing at E3. By the way, I love it.
Yeah, no, it's a pretty good introduction to the game, because the game itself is a series of different stories of these family members.
Yeah.
And this is one story, but broken up into a bunch of kind of different sections, because little girl dream kind of naturally lends itself to being something a bit crazier.
Let's touch on some themes. I mean, obviously death is a big theme. Is that something that you're purposefully going for? Is that what you originally, the story that you originally wanted to tell?
Yeah, I mean, it's not something that we've been focusing on too explicitly. It's something that just kind of arises out of the stories that we're telling. I think for us, the thing that we're focusing on is something that feels sublime, but also intimate.
Yep.
And looking at places where human beings and nature, kind of run into conflict. And, unfortunately, as tiny, fragile creatures, that conflict is pretty one-sided. So in all the stories, people end up dying, but it's not necessarily through any fault of their own. I think all the stories are about people trying to understand the unknown and come to terms with the situation that they're in. And, the fact that it ends badly for them isn't necessarily a bad thing. It's just like that's sort of inevitably what happens. Like, everyone inevitably is going to die. Maybe not, in the exaggerated circumstances that a lot of the Finch members do, but hopefully it's something that doesn't feel too heavy-handed, because it's the truth. I mean, this is just the world that we live in.
Ian, I think it looks absolutely intriguing. For more on what remains of Edith Finch and everything E3, stick with IGN.